Public Library. And also AFA, who I just joined the organization, I think last month. And so I'm really excited to be presenting to everyone and also to be included in this amazing group. So I am going to share my screen. In terms of the roadmap for this evening, I have a slide deck that shows some of my process and some prints, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers at the end. So feel free to save your questions. You can ask them later, or you can put them into the chat and we'll answer them then too. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So as Jordan mentioned, I'm an artist and printmaker based in Providence, but I'm originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. So I like to start artist talks with a photo of my grandparents because a lot of the work that I make using printmaking is about my paternal grandmother. So this is her in the forefront. Her name is Lois Harada, and she and her entire family were forcibly removed from their home in San Diego during World War II. So from 1942 to 1945, they were incarcerated at a camp in Poston, Arizona. So with a lot of my print work, I'm referencing historical documents and posters from that era to then use as source material for my own prints. So these are two letterpress prints that are made from that reference material. The one on the left is from cast metal type, and then the one on the right is from wood type. So for my work, I like to take a lot of the context out of those historical references to then make something that feels a little bit more inviting to people to pull them in to the work. So this is a photo by Dorothea Lange that's pretty well known, also from that period. And for this print, I wanted to take the sign that this shop owner had paid to make and turn that also into a letterpress print. So as we talk about letterpress printing, I'm really excited to talk to the AFA crowd because there's already a great knowledge of printing within the community. So this print started as wood type that's about 1 inch tall that I proofed, scanned, and then turned into a photopolymer plate. So this print is about 13 inches by 40 inches, and it's printed on a Vandercook No. 4 proofing press, and it's actually gone through the press twice. So really the only thing that I don't love about letterpress printing is that you're often limited in terms of size. Oops, sorry about that. You're often limited in terms of size while you're printing. So this print actually went through twice. So I printed I am and am, and then flipped it back around and printed the rest of the sheet. So I'm trying to figure out ways to get around that size restriction, which can be tricky but exciting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where I'm making this work. So I work at a company called DWRI Letterpress. If anyone is familiar with DKNY, the fashion brand, which stands for Donna Karen New York, my boss, Dan Wood, who lives in Rhode Island, thought that it would be really clever to call the company DWRI, Dan Wood, Rhode Island. And we are based on the west side of Providence. Dan has been in business for over 20 years, but in commercial printing for a lot longer. He started in offset printing and then moved into letterpress printing. And we're currently located off of Rice Street in Providence, and we've been there for about 12 years. This wall is sort of a sampling of different things that we do. So we do a lot of wedding invitations, which is what people think of when they think of commercial letterpress printing. Business cards, posters, art prints, CDs, packaging. It's really a wide range of different applications of printing. And I'm really lucky because we have a huge range of equipment. So we have a big collection of wood type. And I mentioned typecasting. We're running a Ludlow for casting larger typefaces. And then we have 2 linotypes, one of which runs pretty regularly. So we're doing a pretty good amount of cast metal type as well. The shop also has a big range of different equipment. So I think when people think of letterpress print shops, they often think of, a cylinder press like a Vandercook or maybe a platen press like a CMP. We really lean into the commercial side of things. So we have 2 windmills, and we just got a windmill that's new to us and maybe from about 1970. So it's actually running in pretty good shape. We also have an automated cylinder press, which you can see over to the left of this photo, which is called a poly. And it's kind of a one of a kind, but runs things in really tight register. We also are running a CMP from 1916, which you can see me here operating. And this press really does get a lot of love in our shop. We have a third press operator named Hope Anderson, who is also a RISD grad, as Dan is, and myself. And this press runs almost every day on invitations and other stationary jobs. On the left here is a kludgy, so we use this primarily for die cutting as well as scoring. And on the right, this is Dan, who's the shop owner, running our linotype with googly eyes. Seems important to add to most machinery. So we do also a lot of ink mixing. So you can see we're big fans of coffee and use that to store our ink. So this is just a little small selection of the Pantones that we keep in reserve. And as well as a little snippet of some of our wood type. So, as we've accumulated wood type over the years, instead of setting a traditional name specimen, we've actually got here some more ingenious titles that Hope actually made. So in terms of the style of work that we do at the shop, there's the commercial side of things, but then we're also really lucky to be able to use the shop to make our own work and to make posters. So, depending on what else is happening at the shop, we have the ability to quickly make a poster. So this is a poster we made a few years back and we're able to distribute to marches. We just reprinted it and it's, pretty much free if you can get to our shop. And we also have them at a few local stores around Providence. But for me, after studying fine art printmaking at RISD, commercial printing has really been kind of a happy place for me to land because I'm able to make a lot of something very quickly, whereas fine art printmaking can be a little on the slower side and the more precious side of things. Whereas with commercial letterpress printing in particular, I can go in, I set this poster up in about 30 minutes and then printed another, 100 copies in 30 more minutes. And then luckily tricked a volunteer into coming in to print another 200. And so this is a poster in a similar vein that was part of an exhibition in 2021. And I filled a whole wall with these posters. So again, for me, being able to make a lot of something quickly, it has become a really important part of my process. I'm stuck on my Google. There we go. So this type should look familiar by this point. That's also the great thing about working in a letterpress print shop is that you're somewhat limited by the type that you have. And that design constraint for me is a really nice thing to work against. So this is an installation that was installed at Brown and launched right around the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearing. So I wanted to think of a way to represent how fast the news cycle felt that it was moving forward by intersplicing the names of Anita Hill and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford in a huge wall installation. These two posters, this one is behind me. I've got a little proof that's been beat up, and that was part of the same show. And this quote will look familiar if anyone's seen the Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary. She references this at the beginning of the documentary, but it's by a famous suffragette. And then on the right is another example of a poster using wood type that was part of a show in 2021 as well, where those Stop Asian Hate posters went. So one thing that I also really like about letterpress printing is that anytime you've physically pressed a letter into the sheet, the print really becomes somewhat sculptural. It's not just a flat poster that's screen printed or offset printed. It's got sort of its own space and its own life. And then I wanted to talk briefly about another poster project. And in 2019, I started a campaign to get Rhode Islanders to rethink a holiday that we celebrate here called Victory Day. And, traditionally, the holiday was celebrated across the country and called Victory Over Japan Day or VJ Day. Rhode Island has always just called it Victory Day, even though most Rhode Islanders will call it VJ Day or Victory Over Japan Day. So as someone who's making work about Japanese American incarceration, the day in particular really didn't sit well with me. So I started a poster series to get people to rethink why they were taking the day off. And so I started with things like Ocean State Day, Lobster Roll Day, Beach Day, Mayor's Bay Day, because there is a Governor's Bay Day. But using this form of a poster, it's such a democratic thing. You print the posters and then they have this whole other life. They go out into the community, people pick them up, you see them in windows, and that's something that I really like. So in 2021, I made another series of posters that, again, started from type that was about 1 inch tall, that then turned into a poster that was about 12 by 30 inches, running through twice. And I just wanted to use a hashtag this year. So again, thinking about how a poster then turns into an analog, from an analog to a digital media. And so this poster, I worked with a lot of local businesses to hang up in downtown Providence. So this is a storefront on Westminster Street. So hanging the 2 different years of posters was really interesting to me, to be able to turn that poster into an installation using multiple copies. This is Bolt Coffee, which is my favorite coffee shop, and they gave me a cup of coffee too while I was installing, which was so nice. And then in addition to making those posters, I took that lettering to a whole different media. So this is nylon lettering that's about 5 feet tall, and I hired a banner towing plane. So anyone who is familiar with the Rhode Island beaches and beaches in general know that when you go to the beach, there's often a plane that's going to carry a message over the beach while you're there. So it's often advertising things like car insurance or, a new beverage. But I wanted to say, okay, people in Rhode Island take Victory Day off to go to the beach. So let's take that message directly to them. And this is a photo of the plane at the beach. And the plane company was really nice, and I think hadn't worked with a lot of artists. So they were really friendly and letting me come in, take pictures. They gave me the whole flight plan, and I was able to share that with people, who were supporters of the project or just interested. And I heard a lot of response, which is a good thing. It was on both sides of people cheering and people booing while they were at the beach, but it did get some response, which was nice. And this project was really kind of a growth moment for me in terms of scale. So not only in terms of the physical size of the thing, but also the financial investment. So one great thing about working at a print shop is that the letters are already there, the paper is pretty cheap, the ink is already there, but this project needed a bigger financial buy-in from me. And I was able to ask some people for help over Instagram, which I think also made people feel more involved in the project. So I wanted to talk next about a recent series of prints that I finished with some grant funding, which again was another step in kind of growing my practice. And this was with funding from the Interlace Project Fund, which is a new fund in Providence that just recently selected a second cohort of artists for project funding. And so this photo is from Manzanar, which is the largest Japanese American incarceration site, and also one that the National Park Service has done a really good job of rebuilding. There are, replicas of buildings that would have been there, of barracks. There's also the guard tower, which you can't actually access, which I'm always a little unclear as to why. And then there's also a gift shop, which is also another moment of, it is a national park, so they've got to have a gift shop. But I wanted to take imagery from the different incarceration sites and pair them with Works Progress Administration posters. So WPA posters are often recognized for being really bright and really graphic. I wanted to use that style of imagery to bring more awareness to the different incarceration sites. So this is a series of 6 posters that are actually all screen printed. But again, using my kind of background in letterpress printing, I'm always thinking about type and text and what that looks like and how it functions on a poster. So the shapes here are all cut from paper, and I use the Library of Congress as my primary resource site. And the type is actually all based from WPA posters that have a kind of a style of lettering in them from that time period. So this type I actually cut out from actual replicas of the posters that I sort of had pulled from the Library of Congress and sort of tweaked a little digitally. And then I actually spent a bunch of time cutting them out and then scanning them. So there was about a week in my studio where it looked like I was writing ransom letters, just as I had these piles of letters kind of strewn about. And for me, there's really no way to duplicate the texture and the quality of the line that you get from cutting something out of a sheet of paper versus drawing it. And that's how a lot of the original lettering for these posters would have been made. So it felt really authentic to me to be able to use that same process and borrowing from those letter forms. Oh, I think I've got to wait until the video finishes. Oh, there's an O. And so here's kind of my pile of letters. So this project, the prints are one component of it, but the lettering is sort of taking a whole different form. So as someone who likes to think about text and likes to think about letters, I have these forms currently saved on my computer. They're all vectors, but they're not really a functional typeface. So anytime I'm setting a poster from them, I'm physically dragging and dropping an A, dragging and dropping a C, which is not really the most efficient thing to do. So I am really happy to announce that I've got a little bit of grant funding from the Rhode Island State Council for the Arts to turn this into a somewhat functional typeface. And I say somewhat functional because I know, as someone who works with letters day in and day out, that that's going to be a big project, but it'll at least be functional enough that people in Providence and anywhere else can use this face, because I think it is a pretty fun display face for posters. The other component with that project, and you can see a little bit more of that type there, is that I used the grant funding to purchase a penny smasher. And so, when I think of a penny smasher, you often think of zoos, national parks, tourist destinations. And so it was another way for me to be able to make a print, except making people choose which penny they wanted to make and then putting the money in and actually doing the physical labor of it. So I really liked the collaborative effort that it turned into, because people gravitated to that recognizable form. But then, it was something a little darker, a little bit more of a spin on that penny. And it was another really good learning process for me, in that I had spent so much time tweaking the text on these pennies. But then when I finally got to the penny company, the first notes I got were, "This is a penny. This is not an art thing." And I was like, well, it can be both. But basically just to say that I had really overthought the design on this penny, which is, an inch and a quarter long. So it was a good process of understanding, again, the constraints, and then trying to figure out how to get around them in a way to be able to match my project. So in addition to trying to figure out grant funding for different projects, I also have been really lucky to attend a few residencies to help further my process. And during my last residency at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, I was actually working on a commission for Providence College. And so this is a group called My Home Court, whose home is at Providence College. And they work with the Providence Parks Department to pick a park, resurface the basketball court, and then work with an artist to create a mural that goes on the top. So previous murals that they've had in Providence have all been based in imagery or pattern, and they were excited to work with me to try and figure out some text for that project. So this is at Davis Park, which is just a few minutes away from my apartment too, which was also really a nice treat. But as I started to get into this project, it was kind of overwhelming to think about, a public work of art is so much different than a poster. It's pretty permanent. And it also has to really appeal to a pretty wide audience. I did a lot of overthinking, which is part of my process too at this point, about what text I should use, what text I shouldn't use, what it should actually say. And as someone who likes to use text in my work, sometimes in a more abstract way, this felt like it needed to be legible and recognizable, which it is from above, but a little trickier when you're on the court itself. And so I ended up pulling from different languages that are pretty prominent within the area, and then thinking about a color palette too that would be pretty easy to reproduce. So again, as printers, we're often defaulting between spot colors or CMYK printing. And so I sort of tried to bridge the two and see what colors I could get that would mirror CMYK printing without being exactly the same. So the letter forms that I ended up using, again, are all based primarily in wood type and metal type that I have accessible to me to use at DWRI Letterpress. So these letter forms, they're pretty distressed. And I think that was something that my home court was more interested in. As a printer, you often want to keep things as clean as possible. And sometimes using the wood type, you do get a little texture, a little kind of distressed quality. They actually wanted more of that. So it felt a little counter to include more of that kind of distressed information, but I think it did give the court a little bit more texture to it and a little bit more feel. And so in the background, I've got a system of numbers that to me kind of indicated play and kind of a communal feel. So this is a video of what the court looks like from above. And so with this project too, again, we're kind of growing the practice in scale. This one, I also learned a lot about collaboration. So I'm really lucky I didn't actually paint this mural. So I worked with my home court and their team. I supplied a file that was pretty much ready to go. And then they work with a nonprofit who is really strong with mural design, who transfers out that whole pattern and then paints it. So it was a good learning moment to go back and forth, on, is this the right pink? Is this the right paint color? The blue stripes here are a lot thinner than they were in the design because that's regulation. And then also too, it was interesting to hear how they had approached the text because the text is already distorted from how I've scanned it and digitized it in. Then they actually ended up freehanding it. So it's really close to the actual design. And I think they did a great job. Also, the Khmer, which is above pass, kind of on the other half of the court, is totally new. So what I mean by that is that it's hobbled together from different scans of other letter forms because we don't have any wood type that matches those characters. So I ended up finding a digital typeface as a reference for those letter forms, but then actually creating those letter forms myself. Oh, we're playing it twice. Hold on a second. So this is actually a really quick photo of some of that scanned wood type. So I ended up, of course, taking a cleaner proof, but just to get started and to think about, what this thing was going to look like, I ended up going into the shop, putting together a rough list of words, and then just trying to play with the type and see what felt interesting to me, what felt like it was going to work. I also had a lot of borders and ornaments that you can see I'm proofing here on the right that sadly I didn't end up using. We kind of just stuck with the text. I think one thing that I've learned about my own process is that I tend to overthink things a lot. Also, I'm really a procrastinator. So, there's always a process of getting too many ideas on one page and then editing. So one of the last projects I want to talk about is a collaboration, again, with Providence College. And this is an installation of their show called Providence Prints. And it's up until March. And the show features work from myself, Dan from DWRI, Counterform and Jacques Bidon, as well as Queer Archive Work and Bench Press. So a lot of local Providence print shops that all have a really great track record of producing protest works, works about contemporary times, queer works. And it's just an amazing collection of kind of printed ephemera and a real appreciation of, offset printing, silkscreen printing, bookbinding. The piece that I contributed to the show is all the way in the back. It's that kind of really busy wallpaper. And this was my first time working with an organization on a commission. And, I'm really lucky that the curator that I worked with on my home court was also my contact for this project. This is a close-up of that wallpaper with a print by Jacques Bidon on the top. And the wallpaper is a 4-color screen print on a repositionable vinyl. So again, you can see some of those letter forms on the left, and this is a time-lapse video of how it all came together. So the wallpaper panels each were about 12 feet long and about 40 inches wide. So I ended up, the plan was initially to digitally print these, which, felt like a little bit of a cop out in a print show. The digital printer didn't want to work for this type of material, so we ended up printing it pretty last minute. And this is my partner, Chris, who was really kind enough to help with that repeat pattern printing. This is a totally different scale from letterpress printing in that it's a repeat. So you have to sort of think about how the pattern lines up into itself and also what the registration is like, which, there's variation because this was really my first time running a repeat this big. But the variation when it was installed had a really nice effect, I think. So again, color palette wise, because I had just come off of that My Home Court project, I was really thinking about CMYK and that color system and trying to think of a way to incorporate those colors into somewhat of a plaid. And, usually most of the text that I use is super legible. This is a case where it was intentionally illegible. So this is a scan of a little snippet of that type. And it's a really condensed wood type that I loved kind of the pattern that you got as it was sort of stacked up next to each other. So, I had quickly taken this proof just to remind myself what the type looked like and ended up pulling this pattern to repeat over and over into that wallpaper. So I'll hop back to that kind of wider shot. It's really not meant to be legible, but it's been amazing to hear how many people have spent a lot of time looking at this wallpaper and trying to figure out what it says. So I think that's the last project that I have. I think I sped right through that. But I know that Alice was also keen for me to share a little bit more about residencies. And I was really lucky to spend 5 weeks at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, working with their print shop, doing a lot of etching. And then also I spent some time at In Cahoots residency in California, which is an amazing program, especially for letterpress printers. There's a beautiful number 3 Vandercook there, as well as a huge collection of wood type and metal type, including some great type from Italy, which is so nice. And also type from Jan Baker. I don't know if there's anyone familiar with Jan. Pretty big name in Providence. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute and hop into the chat. If there are questions from folks about anything that I chatted about, I'm happy to hop in and kind of answer those.
While people are hopping, Lois, if you don't mind me asking you a question. So fortunately my mic was muted because when you talked about really leaning into commercial printing as part of your artistic practice, I was sort of cheering in the background. I love that. And I think, it fits into sort of the Updike attitude generally of commercial printing. This is sort of a really broad and maybe unanswerable question, but I'm wondering if you see that as something that will continue to be a part of your practice, or I don't want to judge fine press printing or people who do artist books and that kind of thing, but I really love the idea that a lot of your printing and your artwork is intended to create change, means that it's sort of by default not effective if it is only being seen by sort of an exclusive audience. So sorry, that's a long comment more than a question, but is this something you want to keep always as part of your practice?
I think so. And also I think because my day-to-day work is in commercial printing, it's always around and always there. And at this point now, the fastest way for me to work out an idea is through a letterpress print, which I know seems really counter to people who maybe just aren't letterpress printing every day. But because I have such access to that equipment, and that's really how my brain is wired at this point, I think that will always be a part of my practice. And, there's definitely a time and a place for fine art printing, but it's not really fitting into my practice at this point. I have some smaller editions that I did make at Anderson Ranch, but it's trickier to show those and to display those. I think there's something so not precious about a commercial print, which is a really nice thing to be able to say, I made 100 of these posters. If you can chip in $10 for paper, if you can chip in $2 for paper, if you just want to come get a bunch of posters, that's fine too. It is also nice to be sort of in between the two. So thinking about letterpress prints as fine art prints, maybe it's just a smaller edition, because that, changes the way people think about prints. And also, again, acknowledging that fine art print art pricing in general is totally a sham. It feels like, so sometimes just giving a letterpress print a higher price makes it feel more fine art in a weird way. But I do think that the accessibility of it, at least for me, is really what has drawn me to it. And there are a lot of things that you can do with commercial printing, like die cutting, foil stamping, that again kind of bridge into the fine art world, that are fun to think about and fun to experiment with. Did that kind of answer your question, Jordan?
Yes, very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great, of course.
I have a question also,
Yeah.
Lois. Just in thinking about kind of dovetailing with Jordan's kind of the opposite extreme of being able to do a residency where I imagine you're there for a few weeks or a month, or I don't know how long those were, but can you talk about sort of the balance of those things? Like it must be really, really a different kind of energy and focus to be in a residency situation than to be going into DWRI.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, when I secretly said I was a procrastinator, the residencies have been great to really focus in for a set amount of time. So the In Cahoots residency was 2 weeks, and it's in Petaluma, California. So you're getting out of your regular environment and really being able to go into the studio anytime you want. And Anderson Ranch was 5 weeks, which I think for me, 4 weeks might be the sweet spot. 2 weeks feels a little too fast, but 5 weeks felt, I was ready to go to New York System at about 3.5 weeks. So it is such a nice dedicated, focused time. It's for me, I find that I have a little bit of performance anxiety about making sure that I'm making enough stuff while I'm at those residencies, but they're really a good time for me to actually reflect and do some research and thinking and writing, which is harder to do in my regular studio practice, which often happens at night or on the weekends, or kind of, I say to Dan, like, hey, can I take Friday off? I have to install a thing that's not done yet. I promise I'll be back on Monday. So those situations. But I do want to try to figure out how to build more time into my practice that has more of that reflective quality. I think for me, there are periods where I'm super productive and then take a break, and then super productive and take a break. It's always easier to get the super productive points funded. So I'm trying to figure out how to get the slightly less productive points funded next. But I think it is, residencies are such a nice time to get somewhere else. And you also meet an amazing cohort of other artists. So I went to RISD for my BFA and didn't get an MFA, which I think is where a lot of people meet other printers that are sort of advancing their careers and thinking about print in a different way. So the residencies have been great for me to mingle with people and get to know other artists too.
Sort of connected to that, I know, I'm pretty sure you've done work in the Updike collection, but I wonder like what, and obviously so much of your work is really, you're really looking at historic images and text. What other kinds of places have you done that kind of research?
Yeah, so part of it is hands-on. So actually going to a residency and taking a look at their type collections. Part of it is online. So I mentioned the Library of Congress website earlier, which I think is a really amazing resource for photographs, but also printed documents and newspapers. But the Updike collection is really the most fun place to go because, as you're throwing out, usually I'm throwing out to Jordan, not like a concise list of things that I like to look at, but like, do you have any things that have a picture of a boat or like a sailing log? Can I come in 20 minutes? And Jordan, kind of grimaces because says usually yes. But that collection is great because it's really hands-on. So it's sort of bridging, the Library of Congress in terms of expanse, and then the hands-on research with getting to look at something, seeing those printed samples and books is so much more impactful than looking at something online. And during the pandemic, I was trying to make a trip to Cornell. There's a whole series of pamphlets that people would have been given when they left the incarceration camps, but I wasn't able to go. So instead of visiting the library, I actually just downloaded their really high resolution PDFs, letterpress printed them at my residency at In Cahoots, and then ended up binding those pamphlets and those books. So because I wasn't able to see the thing, I kind of made what I thought the thing would have looked like, and then used that as a jumping off point for other work.
The PPL staff has taken over. So does anyone else have questions or comments for Lois? Any of our visitors?
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. And your work is really great.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
Lois, do you have, I know we talked about the pieces that are up now, but is there anything you're working on that you can tell us about? Or is it like too sub rosa at this point?
Yeah, so the grant funding from RISCA is the next thing that's up. So working on figuring out how that typeface actually becomes a typeface. And I'm really lucky to be a first-year adjunct professor at RISD in the graphic design department and also in the printmaking department. But the graphic design department has a license for a software tool that helps you make that typeface. So hopefully I'm already a few steps ahead in that sense. So I think the winter time will be spent, trying to ignore how weird the vector shapes are that I made instead of kind of overthinking them and figuring out how to make that a usable thing that I can share with people as a resource. I think that's really another thing about letterpress printing that, I wish it was more accessible to people, but it is such an overhead in terms of equipment, maintenance, and just collecting of equipment, which can be tough. So this is sort of my way to share a little bit of my practice. Apart from that, I have no idea, Christina. I'm probably writing some more grants, some terrible grants.
No, part of all of our lives. And then the other question I had was, if somebody wants to get started in learning printmaking, like what would you suggest in Providence if you are not going to go to RISD? I mean, but
yeah, Providence is a really amazing space for printmaking in general. So there are a lot of access points, one of which is the AS220 community print shop. And actually, the reason that I stayed in Providence after graduating from RISD was that I was teaching a silkscreen printing class there as a senior. And so just decided to stick around in Providence because I had a job. But they offer really affordable classes, really affordable shop time, which is something that's tricky in the print sphere. And then there are also just a lot of printmakers in town who are generally really friendly and really ready to share information. So if you don't know how to make something, chances are someone in town does and is happy to share that information. So I would say checking out AS220 is a good place to start, or just reaching out to other artists in town that you like their work and asking sort of, how are you making things? How can I make the same things? And I'll say too, Bench Press is a great access point too. They've got for book production, silkscreen printing. They have a small letterpress press that we're going to work on this winter. And then they also have 2 risographs as well as a perfect binding setup. So they're really ready for small publishing, which I think is something that Providence has sort of been missing, but is kind of, a good key component to have in a print sphere.
they actually did a really beautiful catalog for us for the show that our colleague Kate Wells co-curated last spring, Tomboy. Absolutely beautiful, and it was really wonderful to work with them. So yeah. Jordan, anything else that you can think of that you want to ask or say?
The other thing I was going to say, which is of interest to nobody else, but it has been, I guess I've known you and Dan for at least a decade or so. I did not realize that DWRI was a play on DKNY. So that is a shocker to me. Like I feel so ignorant for not having picked that up.
Well, it gets called all kinds of different things. People call the shop Dan Wood Letterpress, Danwood, Rhode Island, Danwood RI. It's a whole conglomeration of different things. And it's also really awkward to answer the phone. As the person who answers the phone a lot. So hopefully Dan gets to watch this later and sees how excited I am to be an employee of 12 years. So thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to work.
Well, last call for any other questions or comments, but otherwise, Lois, we were so when Alice Beckwith, who is the president of AFA New England and could not be with us tonight, but was the person that contacted Jordan and me about doing this program. We've done several programs with AFA New England, and it's been really wonderful to work with Alice. But when she said that her proposal was to have a program with Lois, of course, we were both like jumping through our computers to say like, yes, 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 we love Lois. So this was a especially wonderful treat for us. And it was so great to get to see more of your beautiful work and hear more about what you're doing. And we look forward to seeing you in the Updike collection and around town. And thank you so very much. And thanks to everybody for coming tonight.